Good morning. So this morning I'm going to talk about the South Orange County Hydromodification Management Plan. We're currently in this kind of weird regulatory position right now with it because we received a letter from the regional board commenting on the HMP and making specific comments on the fact that we don't have the regulatory authority to propose additional exemptions. And so right now we're assisting the county, and the county's negotiating with the regional board on trying to find a regulatory fix so that we can propose additional exemptions. And the primary one that we're really looking at is the large river exemption. And I'll walk through that and what that means. And it can have significant effects for projects within your jurisdictions. So I'm going to go through, kind of walk through the HMP, identify what's in it, how it applies, how it kind of will fit in with the model WQMP eventually. So this identifies the contents of the HMP, and I'm going to essentially go through all of this here in today's presentation. So the first part is the introduction. And the idea here is that we want to define what hydromodification is for people so that people have an understanding of really what it is and how it affects projects. So what is hydromodification? It is really the changes in the magnitude and frequency of stream flows, and that's associated with increases in impervious surfaces. So based on these increases of impervious surfaces due to urbanization, we're seeing changes in the hydrology of a watershed, and that's affecting the downstream receiving waters. So what we're seeing is erosion, sedimentation, and also potentially degradation of in-stream habitat. So within the permit, there is a requirement to develop a hydromodification management plan to help manage these increases in runoff discharge rates and durations from priority development projects. So the primary causes that we're seeing from hydromodification is really based on the land use changes within a watershed. And the effects that we're really seeing and the changes are, a change in site water balance. So we're seeing less water that's being infiltrated into the soil, more water that is actually running off of that particular site. And so we're changing that both the surface and near surface runoff, so that interflow just in the shallow groundwater. We're also changing the groundwater recharge in that area. And then one of the things that's not really thought of much with hydromodification, it's not just a matter of changing the hydrology, but it's also a matter of changing the sediment load and delivery and transport of that sediment, which also affects downstream receiving waters. So collectively, this is referred to as hydromodification, and we are seeing significant impacts to downstream receiving waters based on those conversion of impervious surfaces. So just gives you a little bit of idea of what we're talking about here and the effects. So all of these areas have a common thread, and that is that there's a large amount of impervious surfaces that have essentially caused in these areas downcutting of a receiving water. So you can see, all these, this used to be, look a little bit more like this, but a significant more downcutting within this stream network because those increases of velocity and volume within that receiving water. So a little bit about how we developed the HMP. So all 13 South County permittees were involved in its development. We developed an HMP work group. And we essentially had 3 meetings with that work group to develop the HMP. We went through kind of the identification of what hydromodification is, looking at the permit specifically on what we needed to develop in the HMP, and then we developed a document, and we took into consideration that this needs to be developer friendly and easy to use. It needs to be that way not only for the developers but also for plan check staff so that they can easily understand what is the criteria and how is it to be implemented on development sites. We also have, which we'll go through in a lot more detail this afternoon, we developed a model that will help in actually meeting the criteria and helping developers size BMPs to meet that criteria, as well as plan checkers to be able to review if a development site is in compliance. So a little bit about the timeline and the development of the HMP. So after we went through and developed the HMP through these workshops, we developed a first draft and submitted it in December of 2011. The regional board reviewed the document. provided a comment letter in April of 2012. And that letter primarily focused on the technical aspects of the HMP. It reviewed essentially the exemptions that we proposed. It didn't agree with some of the exemptions. Some of the exemptions it identified that we needed to make changes, and others it just didn't comment on altogether. And the one it didn't comment on was the larger exemption. And that's significant for, in discussion of the subsequent letter that we received in July 31st of this year, where that letter, and I'm going to go through it in a little bit more detail at the end of this presentation, but that letter focused more on a regulatory aspect of not being able to propose exemptions. So a little bit of a nuance there and a little bit of difference between the first letter and the second letter. Really basically, you know, we're basically a little bit confused with the response of the regional board, and that's why we're coordinating with them to be able to get some of those exemptions back in. Section 3 is a literature review. This is actually a requirement of the permit to develop a literature review. And really, we wanted to also look at what is the state of the science in hydromodification that's out there. We wanted to use the most up-to-date science to integrate an appropriate criteria into the HMP that will really help to mitigate the hydromodification impacts that we're seeing. That literature review includes sections on how to manage hydromodification, really looking at a couple different approaches, the flow control approach, also using continuous simulation modeling, which is a requirement of the permit. We also looked at the appropriate rainfall data, the losses we'd see from rainfall in natural conditions based on infiltration and evapotranspiration. And then we also wanted to really look at what are the natural conditions, because the standard within the permit requires us to look at trying to mimic those natural conditions for a set of frequency of storms. And that's really critical to understand that we're not just looking to pre-project on what's existing on that particular site for redevelopment projects, but we're looking at what would have been the natural conditions for that site. Section 4 is really, between Section 4 and 5 is really the meat of the document. This is where we go through what are the criteria, the applicability requirements, what are all the exemptions. We go through alternative compliance. We have a tiered set of requirements. And then we also identify what are some of the hydrologic management measures. What are the BMPs that can help you meet the criteria? So this is really where we get into the meat of what needs to happen for priority development projects. So the criteria. So within the permit, there was a requirement to use continuous simulation. So based on our literature review, we identified the criteria as essentially being that post-project runoff flow rates and durations do not exceed pre-development, and again, naturally occurring pre-development flow rates for essentially from 10% of the 2-year up to the 10-year event. Those are the storms that we see that are really affecting hydromodification. The storms larger than that are really not having that much of effect on hydromodification, but it's really these smaller, more frequent storm events that are causing the downstream impacts in receiving waters. And as mentioned before, the South Orange County hydrology model was really identified as a tool and developed as a tool to help PDPs meet this criteria. So I'm going to go through a couple of the exemptions, and you notice in parentheses we have proposed and in red. That's because this is something that we're still negotiating with the regional board. One of the exemptions that we proposed was really engineered channels. So basically, we propose this exemption because the channels that are engineered within South County are really designed to be able to convey the 25-year event and full build out of the 25-year event. And so what we wanted to do is really find a nexus of what are the streams that are really being impacted. If they're engineered and designed for that 25-year event, then there really should be no impacts from all the storms up to that 25-year event. So there's really no sense in having priority development projects implement on-site controls if there is no effect from them implementing those controls on-site. So the idea here is that any priority development projects that discharge into engineered channels that have the ability to convey those storms, the hydromod storms, up to the 10-year event, really should not have to implement on-site hydromodification controls. This is something we've gotten pushback from the regional board on, and they're saying that the permit only allows conveyance channels that are concrete line bed and bank from the point of discharge all the way either to the ocean or estuaries or bays. We don't agree with this. We feel like if it's an engineered channel, it's designed for that there's really there's no need to implement on-site hydromodification controls. The regional board's response to that is, well, maybe in the future there'd be a way we could take out that engineering and try to restore the channels to a natural condition. Some places that might be possible, but I would say the vast majority of places within South Orange County, it's not possible. And the reason for that is there's development within the floodplain. Those channels were designed as flood control channels primarily to protect public safety and property. One of the other exemptions that we proposed was in-stream flood control and restoration projects. Again, flood control projects themselves are really designed to protect people and property. And so there shouldn't be another layer of requirements on those projects to try to meet a hydromodification control standard when they're really designed to prevent flooding in the first place. So we felt like it would be very hard to implement hydromodification controls for these type of projects because these projects are actually working in the channel. So unless you have right-of-way adjacent to that channel, it'd be nearly impossible to meet this criteria, which would prevent these projects from going forward. And these projects, as we all know, are important to protect public safety and property. The other one is in-stream restoration projects. The idea with these projects is actually to help meet the whole intent of the hydromodification management plan, and the intent that the regional board is looking at is to try to restore some of these channels. So there shouldn't, again, be another layer of requirements put on these projects. These projects should be categorically exempt. Once they go in, there's no other requirements that they need to meet. They're really designed to help meet and restore some of the beneficial uses of those receiving waters. The third and probably one of the most important exemptions is the large river reaches. So the idea here is that with the larger rivers, that there's not as much of an impact on those stream reaches from really the small amount of detention or on-site hydromodification control measures on-site that would affect those large river reaches. The idea is that those large river reaches, as you get larger storms that come through, they essentially reset. You essentially get a large amount of sediment moving about, and so the small impacts that you would see on those receiving waters for the smaller storms essentially get reset with the larger storms. We based this technical argument on some analysis that was done for the San Diego HMP. And essentially what the criteria is that for those drainage areas that exceed 100 square miles and the 100-year design flow within that large river reach is greater than 20,000 CFS, then essentially anything any priority development projects that discharge to those larger reaches that meet this criteria would be exempt. Again, there's no impact on the receiving water or very little impact on the receiving water from those smaller hydromodification storms on these large river reaches. Again, the regional board didn't comment on this exemption in their first letter. In the second letter, they said, well, you don't have the ability to propose an additional exemption. So they're not commenting on the technical merits of this exemption. They're really commenting on the ability within the HMP to propose additional exemptions. The other, and then the last criteria on this is that it has to be discharged from a priority development project, has to be discharging directly to this large river or through a conveyance that is designed and engineered to be able to convey the full 10-year build-out capacity. Section 4.4 of the HMP is really having to do with alternative compliance. So what this means is similar to the LID alternative compliance, if you cannot meet the criteria on site, you are subject to hydromodification, but you can't meet it on site. There's a couple different steps that you can do. The first option is off-site mitigation. So, and there's two options within off-site mitigation. So The first step is you would go and do an on-site technical feasibility study. You're identifying why you cannot meet that hydromodification control criteria on-site. So you're essentially submitting that with the preliminary WQMP. You're identifying the results of SOCHM on, you've tried everything, you've integrated your hydrologic source controls, your LID site designs, and with all of that, you still cannot meet the criteria on site. So you're essentially identifying that it's infeasible to meet it on site. So once you've done that and you've coordinated with the jurisdiction, then you have the ability to implement an off-site mitigation or in-stream restoration project. So with the off-site mitigation, you're looking to implement a project to meet the hydrologic criteria for your site. So you're essentially creating a detention basin or some other hydrologic control elsewhere within your same hydrologic unit. Or you have the ability to implement an in-stream restoration project, but it has to be implemented in the receiving waters of your priority development project. This gets a little bit more complicated. There's a whole lot more layers of permitting that goes on, but we do want to leave it open as an opportunity, and the regional board essentially wants to see restoration of those receiving waters. So the receiving water that your project is discharging into, although it has to have impacts from hydromodification to have this option available to you. The second overall option for alternative compliance is if the jurisdiction that the priority development project is in has developed what's called a jurisdictional HMP mitigation bank, then you can pay, a priority development project can pay into that bank. Now, this is only available if that co-permittee has developed such a bank. Now, in coordination with a lot of the South County permittees, this is something that they don't want to touch with the 10-foot pole. It gets complicated. You have to put money up front and start building projects and so forth. There's a couple permittees that are interested in potentially putting this together. But again, this option is only available if it is available and developed by that, essentially by that co-permittee. We've also developed tiered requirements. So what we wanted to do is, obviously we have a lot of different types of development projects. So we've tried to tier these out into kind of the larger development projects, essentially greater than 100 acres, the medium development projects, essentially greater than an acre but less than 100 acres, the small projects which are less than an acre, and then the roadway projects as well. So the idea here is that there's a little bit nuanced different requirements with each of these different tiers, but the primary difference is for the small development projects, we wanted to provide and reduce the burden on those projects. A lot of these will be redevelopment projects and so forth, and so what we've integrated is a simplified technical feasibility study where they essentially are just going through basic steps to identify why meeting the criteria on site is really infeasible. And then for the roadway projects, which what we originally proposed is to implement a green streets approach, that doesn't look like it's really getting any favor with the regional board. So that will likely have to change within the HMP. But we'll see. So Section 5, we've talked about kind of the hydrologic portion of the HMP and that criteria. Section 5 is really based on the sediment portion of HMP, and also looking at bioassessment standards. So looking at sediment supply, essentially what we're looking at is trying to maintain that sediment supply of that site if that sediment supply is really a contributor of bed sediment within your receiving water. So you don't want to starve those receiving waters of your sediment. So we've integrated what's called a triad approach, as well as there is an alternative compliance option. So essentially step one with the triad approach is you're looking at your site, you're comparing the sediment on your site to the sediment within the downstream receiving water. You're identifying if it is the same type of sediment. Are we seeing that your development site is actually a source of sediment? Well, then step two is you need to try to avoid those sources of sediment on your development site. Now, what does this mean for priority development projects? It means the days of mass grading are essentially over, at least as we know it now. There still might be able to be some mass grading, but that's only for those sites where sediment really isn't a source. So what you're trying to do is you're protecting your first and second order streams on site if you've identified that that site is really a source of sediment within the receiving water. So you're looking at, can you avoid those impacts on site? And then, if that's infeasible, then there's an option to bypass your flow and sediment supply from your site. That gets a little bit more complicated because you get into a situation where you might have to recreate a stream on site, and the science of that is, it's not that great right now. So if your site is a source of sediment, you will need to look at avoiding those impacts from your site. That's the best way. Now, if you look at all of those 3 steps and it's still infeasible, the development site has the option to develop an alternative modeling approach to show that that particular development site is truly not a source of sediment on site. That gets a little bit more involved, and we'll go into a little bit more detail of that this afternoon.
What's the likelihood of a development not being a sediment source?
It really depends on that particular area in the watershed. It's going to be really on a case-by-case basis. Yeah, so we haven't gone through the analysis to identify all the different sources of sediment. That's a significant effort, and really we're putting that burden on the developers to go through that analysis and develop.
It could be beneficial to go through the exercise for the developer. Okay.
Yep. Section 6 of the HMP is really where we're looking at how to identify the effectiveness of the criteria that we've developed for the HMP. So what we're doing is we're looking at bioassessment monitoring and really going through a monitoring approach to assess the effectiveness of those criteria. So essentially what the HMP incorporates is monitoring benthic macroinvertebrates communities essentially once a year to identify if we're seeing impacts from development sites and how the criteria is, as it's being implemented, is it an effective criteria to essentially protect those critters downstream. We're also looking at doing channel surveys, so identifying, and this is going to take some time to really understand, because obviously channels don't change on a yearly basis unless we see large storm events coming through. But looking at channel sections and seeing over time what kind of impacts on those channel segments are we seeing from development sites that don't have any kind of controls in them to the development sites that have implemented the criteria. And again, this will take time not only for the channel to see the effects, but for development to move forward within the watershed with implementing that criteria. We're also looking at essentially what the performance protocol would be. So there would be BMP inspections per the model WQMP, so making sure that the BMPs are properly maintained. And then also looking at, do we see, there's requirements within the permit to look at IBI scoring, so again looking at habitat, and if we do see a change in that or a rapid change in the channel morphology, what's the cause of that? Is this really a rare storm event? Is it lack of performance from the hydrologic source controls on site? Is the criteria really effective? And so looking at all that information, and again, looking at this over time, we're looking at probably 5 to 10 years before we really understand, is this criteria really being effective? Section 7 talks about integration of the HMP into the model WQMP. So Aaron talked a little bit about this. But until we have a finding of adequacy from the regional board on the HMP, we'll kind of be in a waiting period where this won't be integrated into the model WQMP as of yet. But once we do have that finding of adequacy, it will get integrated into the model WQMP, and there will be the options to essentially go through alternative compliance and looking at meeting both the hydrologic and sediment criteria within for priority development projects.
So that letter they sent us didn't start the time?
The what?
That letter they sent us,
They did, yeah. They sent a letter, and that's actually this letter here. So essentially what's in the letter is they've provided comments on primarily on the exemptions that we suggested. They basically identify that we don't have the ability through the permit to propose any additional exemptions. They find an initial finding of adequacy within that letter, but we've had a couple meetings with the regional board already. We identified that essentially that the one exemption that we need to have included within there is the large river exemption. And the reason for that is that in their April 25th, 2012 letter, they basically said, they didn't comment on the large river exemption. They essentially said, go ahead and start implementing those portions of the HMP that will likely be in the final. Well, with no comments on the large river exemption, priority development projects started using and relying upon that exemption. So to answer your question, we're not sure exactly if we have a finding of adequacy or not, because that letter is a little ambiguous on, are we really allowed to move forward with that? So that's why we're negotiating with them right now. Right now we're kind of in this kind of stalemate right now as far as, is the HMP actually valid or not? Maybe there are, if you look at the April 25th, 2012 letter, there are portions of the HMP that can move forward. Well, then the July 31st, 13th letter contradicts that. And so their letters themselves are contradicting. So I don't have a good answer for you on, are we in a point where we can actually move forward with the HMP? I would say right now, we're probably not. So the other parts of the letter that are important is, so essentially all the exemptions that we're proposing, the effects of the letter is removing all of those. And so the only exemptions that are in place are the exemptions that are identified within the permit themselves. And those exemptions include discharges from PDPs directly via underground storm drains directly to bays of the ocean, or those projects that discharge into concrete lined channels, and they have to be concrete lined all the way from the point of discharge to the ocean, bays, estuaries, or water storage reservoirs. So, and then municipal roadway projects also have to meet all the HMP requirements. So essentially those are out, those will likely stay out. So right now, we're supposed to have gotten some input from the regional board at the end of last week, which as far as I know, we haven't received, on how we can move forward and include at least the large river exemption still within the HMP. So stay tuned. This is kind of an ongoing issue, and we'll hopefully get resolution on this in the next couple weeks, but I wouldn't hold your breath.
So just real quick, are they under the same understanding about our timeline? I mean, I know you have the 90-day requirement, and we're saying, yeah, we're negotiating, but is that also their side of it? I mean, don't we have like a December something?
Yeah, I mean, basically what the letter says is that, effective December of this year that the HMP would go into effect. But that is with removing all the exemptions, and the county doesn't want to remove all the exemptions. So essentially what the regional board standpoint is that there's a little bit of give on the letter. They've considered retracting the letter altogether and just kind of not even issuing a letter, which would mean that we could still implement the HMP, or at least those portions of it, based on the April 25th, 2012 letter. But again, we're working with them on, what the fix is. So they understand all the impacts of what their letter has, what their most current letter would have on projects that are already moving forward. And so they understand that we need to get it fixed, right away. The only problem with that is we met with them, I think it's been almost 2 months now. So we met with them right after we got the letter, so I think in the first week of August. So anyway, it's up in the air. So I apologize, I don't have the detailed answers because we just don't know where we're at with them right now. Okay, real quick, just want to go through a quick example, and I won't go through this in detail because we're going to go through this more this afternoon. But just to give you an idea on kind of how this affects the sizing of BMPs for development projects. We worked on a project close to here in Rancho Mission Viejo, and we essentially sized BMPs to meet the HMP criteria. And essentially what we did is we looked at, how big the BMPs would be essentially under the 2002 permit versus how big those BMPs would have to be under the fourth term permit, looking at both the LID requirement as well as the hydromodification requirement. And so essentially what this came out to be was the BMP in the 2009 permit essentially have to be about 4 times the size of a BMP under the 2002 permit. So what this really means for development projects is setting aside a larger area of land to implement BMPs. So really a significant effect on those development projects, which is another reason why these exemptions that we're trying to get in there are so critical. The exemptions that we put together are really based on those projects not really having an impact on the receiving waters. And so, so that's why we're fighting very hard. There has to really be a nexus to an impact to put requirements on development sites. And if there is no nexus of impacts, then there really shouldn't be a requirement. We'll go through SOCHM a little bit more in detail this afternoon, but this is the model, and it's available at ocwatersheds.com. This is available to development projects to be able to use and size their BMPs. So the idea here is that you implement your source control and site design BMPs. The model has the ability to do that. Then you implement your treatment control BMPs, your retention BMPs, and the idea is that you want to try to get your mitigated flow to be less than your pre-development flow. Again, the model guidance and the reviewer checklist is available online. With that, I will take any questions.